Obinna was once a man of great wealth and respect. He had a good job, a loving wife, Chidinma, and 2 beautiful children. His life was the envy of many in his community. But everything changed when he lost his job. With no means to support his family and his pride wounded, Obinna turned to alcohol. As the days passed, his addiction grew, and so did the tension in his household. His paranoia led him to believe that his best friend, Chike, was having an affair with Chidinma. One fateful night, consumed by rage and alcohol, Obinna committed a terrible crime. He killed his beloved wife, Chidinma. But when the police arrived, it was Chike who was blamed for the crime. Despite his innocence, Chike was sentenced to life in prison, and Obinna was left to live with the weight of his guilt. Now, alone in his dark living room, Obinna tries to drown his guilt with alcohol. He sits silently, lost in his thoughts, when suddenly his phone rings. The sound startles him, and he hesitates before answering. With a shaky voice, he says, "Hello?" On the other end, a calm but threatening voice speaks. "Obinna, we need to talk about what really happened that night." Obinna's heart races. Fear grips him as he realizes that his secret might not be as safe as he thought. He quickly hangs up the phone, his mind racing. Who could it be? What do they know? The guilt that he has tried so hard to suppress begins to surface again, and he can't shake the feeling that his world is about to come crashing down. Meanwhile, Nkechi, Chike's wife, sits alone in her modest home. Her eyes are swollen from crying, and her heart is heavy with sorrow. She holds a photo of Chike, her husband, who is now imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit. Tears stream down her face as she remembers the life they once had. But as she sits there, something changes within her. She wipes her tears away and looks at the photo with determination. "I will not rest until I prove your innocence, Chike," she whispers. "They took you away from us, but I will bring you back." With that, Nkechi resolves to uncover the truth, no matter what it takes. She knows the road ahead will be difficult, but she is ready to face it. As she begins her quest for justice, the shadows of the past start to stir, and secrets long buried begin to resurface. Obinna, haunted by the mysterious call, and Nkechi, determined to prove her husband's innocence, are now on a collision course with the truth. The story that began with a single act of betrayal is far from over. As the days pass, the tension builds, and both Obinna and Nkechi realize that the truth will not stay hidden forever. But who will uncover it first, and what will the cost be? Welcome back to our channel. We cherish you all so much. Thanks a lot to both our returning subscribers and new ones. If this is your first time, please support this channel by subscribing to enjoy our beautiful stories. Let's now enjoy the part 2 of this story with a chilled drink. Cheers! After the tragedy, Obinna's guilt was overwhelming. The image of his wife, Chidinma, haunted him day and night. But as time passed, the intensity of his guilt began to fade. Life, as it often does, moved on. One day, to his surprise, Obinna was offered a job that was even more prestigious and better paying than his previous one. The demands of the new position were high, but Obinna welcomed the challenge. The work kept him busy, and in the hustle and bustle of his new life, the memories of his crime slowly began to blur. With his newfound success, Obinna struggled to balance his demanding job and the responsibility of caring for his 2 children. He loved them, but his focus was elsewhere, on his work, his reputation, and anything that could help him forget the past. One weekend, Obinna decided to visit his parents in the village. They were concerned about him and the well-being of their grandchildren. They could see that Obinna was struggling to manage everything on his own, and they worried about the children who were growing up without the care and attention they needed. During the visit, his parents gently suggested that he consider remarrying. "You need a wife who can take care of the children," his mother advised. "Your job is important, but your children need a mother's love and care." At first, Obinna hesitated. The memory of Chidinma still lingered in his mind, though it was becoming more distant with each passing day. But the idea of having someone to help at home was appealing, especially with his busy schedule. Eventually, he agreed, and soon after, he found himself a new wife, a woman who was charming and seemed perfect for the role. With his new wife by his side, Obinna's life seemed to return to normal. He was busy with work, and at home, his new wife took care of the household. However, this new chapter in Obinna's life came at a cost. His children, who had already suffered the loss of their mother, now faced a new form of neglect. Obinna was so engrossed in his work and his new marriage that he barely noticed the changes in his children's lives. They were often late to school, having to walk long distances by themselves. The school fees were not paid on time, and they were frequently sent home, embarrassed and alone. Their headmistress became increasingly worried and made several attempts to contact Obinna. She sent letters, made phone calls, and even invited him to the school, but Obinna was always too busy to respond. At home, the new wife reveled in her position. She enjoyed the comfort and status that came with being Obinna's wife, but she showed little concern for the children. She did not encourage Obinna to spend time with them, nor did she take any initiative to care for their needs. The children's pain was ignored, and they slowly began to feel like outsiders in their own home. As the days turned into months, Obinna's memories of his past life, of Chidinma and Chike, faded into the background. He lived a comfortable life, enjoying the perks of his new job and the company of his new wife. He convinced himself that this was his second chance, that he deserved to be happy and successful. But beneath the surface, something was wrong. The children's sadness, the neglect they suffered, and the unresolved guilt of his past began to form cracks in the facade of his perfect life. Yet, Obinna chose to ignore it all. He didn't want to remember Chidinma's death or the betrayal of his best friend Chike, who was still rotting in prison for a crime he didn't commit. He didn't think about Nkechi and her children, left to fend for themselves while Chike served his sentence. Obinna told himself that he had moved on, but deep down, he knew that the past had not truly left him. It lingered in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. Though the tragic death of Chidinma had faded from the daily gossip, it was still a topic that occasionally surfaced in quiet conversations. The initial shock and outrage had subsided, but the memory of what had happened lingered in the minds of those who knew the family. Whenever Chidinma's name was mentioned, a heavy silence would follow, as people exchanged knowing glances and whispered theories. The truth about that fateful night remained hidden, but the questions it raised had not been fully laid to rest. As the whispers about Chidinma's death grew faint, another story began to unfold. This time, the focus shifted to Nkechi, her children, and Chike, who remained imprisoned for a crime he did not commit. Nkechi had not been able to visit Chike in several months. The last time she had seen him was during her first visit, shortly after his imprisonment. Since then, life had become increasingly difficult. The small amount of money she had managed to save was long gone, and every day was a battle just to put food on the table for her children. She clearly remembers how she asked Chike to tell her the truth about what really happened. "Chike, you know I love you and trust you. It's just the two of us here, and I promise I won't tell anyone about our conversation. Please, did you kill Chidinma?" Chike replied, "Nkechi, my love, I've never been interested in any other woman but you. I went there to help a friend in need. When I arrived, I found Chidinma lying in a pool of blood. I don't even know how or what happened to cause her death. 3 months after Chike was sent to prison, Nkechi discovered she was pregnant. The news brought mixed emotions, joy at the thought of a new life, but overwhelming despair at the realization of how much harder things were about to become. Her already strained finances would now have to stretch even further, and the burden of providing for her growing family weighed heavily on her shoulders. To make matters worse, her landlord had recently informed her that her rent was due, and if she didn't pay within a month, she and her children would be evicted. The thought of being homeless terrified Nkechi, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't come up with the money. Desperate and out of options, Nkechi decided to visit Obinna, hoping that he might be willing to help. She remembered how her husband, Chike, had always been there for Obinna and his family during their times of need. With this in mind, she made her way to Obinna's house, praying that he would show her the same kindness. When she arrived, Obinna's new wife answered the door. The woman's expression was cold and unfriendly, and she made it clear that Nkechi was not welcome. But before Nkechi could turn away, Obinna appeared, and much to his wife's dismay, told her to let Nkechi in. Nkechi sat down in Obinna's luxurious living room, feeling out of place and vulnerable. She took a deep breath and began to explain her situation, the financial struggles, the pregnancy, the looming threat of eviction. As she spoke, she watched Obinna's face for any sign of compassion, but his expression remained indifferent. When she finished, there was a heavy silence in the room. Then Obinna spoke, his voice cold and detached. "I can help you," he said, "but it will come at a price." Nkechi's heart sank as she realized what he was implying. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. The man who had once been her husband's best friend was now demanding something so vile in exchange for his help. Her eyes filled with tears as she thought of how Chike had always been there for Obinna, never asking for anything in return. "I can't do that," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Obinna shrugged, as if her pain meant nothing to him. "Then there's nothing I can do for you," he replied, his tone final. Nkechi stood up, tears streaming down her face. Without another word, she turned and left the house, vowing never to set foot there again. A few days later, Nkechi mustered the courage to visit Chike in prison. Her pregnancy was now showing, and as she walked through the prison gates, she felt a mixture of dread and sadness. How would Chike react when he saw her like this? How would she explain everything that had happened? When Chike saw Nkechi, his eyes lit up with a mixture of joy and sorrow. He noticed her swollen belly, and his heart ached at the thought of the child he would never get to hold. He reached out through the bars to touch her hand, his eyes searching hers for answers. "What happened?" he asked softly, his voice filled with concern. Nkechi took a deep breath and began to tell him everything: the financial struggles, the pregnancy, the eviction notice, and finally, her visit to Obinna. She hesitated when she reached the part about Obinna's demand, but Chike's gentle squeeze on her hand gave her the strength to continue. As she spoke, tears filled her eyes, and by the time she finished, she was crying uncontrollably. Chike's face darkened with anger and sadness as he listened. The betrayal of his best friend cut deep, but what hurt him most was seeing the pain in Nkechi's eyes. He wanted to protect her, to take away all her worries, but he was powerless, trapped behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. Chike wiped away his own tears and looked at Nkechi with determination. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "But we'll get through this. There's a friend of mine you can contact. He visited me here a while back and promised to help. I'll give you his number." Nkechi nodded, grateful for Chike's strength and support, even in such a dire situation. She took the number and promised to reach out to the friend as soon as she could. But as she left the prison, the weight of her circumstances pressed down on her even more heavily. The road ahead was uncertain, and the future seemed bleak. After Nkechi left, Chike was consumed by a deep sadness. He felt trapped, not just physically, but emotionally. The thought of his wife struggling alone, pregnant and without support, tore at his heart. He had always been the one to protect and provide for his family, but now he was helpless. Chike couldn't stop thinking about Obinna's betrayal. The man he had once trusted with his life had turned his back on him and his family in their time of need. The pain of that betrayal was almost unbearable, and Chike found himself sinking into a deep despair. But despite his overwhelming sadness, there was still a flicker of hope within him. He knew that Nkechi was strong, and he believed that somehow they would find a way to survive this ordeal. He held on to that hope, even as the darkness of his situation threatened to swallow him whole. Since the death of their mother, Kamsi and Adaora had lived in a house that no longer felt like a home. The warmth and love that Chidinma had once filled their lives with were gone, leaving behind a cold emptiness. The children missed their mother terribly. Every day they longed for her comforting presence, her gentle smile, and her tender words. But the more they missed her, the more they felt the deep void she had left in their hearts. Obinna, who should have been their source of comfort and strength, had abandoned them emotionally. He was too consumed with his own life, his new job, and his new wife to notice the pain his children were enduring. Kamsi and Adaora were left to fend for themselves, feeling like strangers in their own home. Their stepmother, who should have taken on a motherly role, treated them with indifference at best and cruelty at worst. One evening, as the sun was setting, Kamsi and Adaora were sitting quietly in their room, trying to stay out of their stepmother's way. Suddenly, Obinna's wife stormed into the room, her face twisted with anger. "Kamsi!" she shouted, her voice echoing off the walls. "Where is the money you stole from my purse?" Kamsi looked up, bewildered and scared. "I didn't steal anything," he said, his voice trembling. "Don't lie to me, boy," she hissed. "If you don't return that money, I'll make sure your father beats you until you confess." Kamsi's heart started pounding. He was innocent, but he knew that his stepmother was not one to be reasoned with. Tears welled up in his eyes as he tried to plead his case. "I didn't take any money," he whispered, but his stepmother's mind was made up. Later that evening, Obinna returned home. His wife wasted no time in telling him about the theft. She exaggerated the story, painting Kamsi as a disobedient and ungrateful child. Obinna's face hardened with anger as he listened to her. Without waiting to hear Kamsi's side of the story, Obinna stormed into the room where his son was sitting, trembling with fear. "Kamsi," he shouted, "how dare you steal from your stepmother?" Kamsi looked up at his father, his eyes wide with fear and sadness. "I didn't steal anything, Papa," he said softly, but Obinna was too angry to listen. "You think I'll let you get away with this?" Obinna growled, raising his hand as if to strike the boy. But then something inside Kamsi snapped. He had endured so much pain, so much loneliness, and he couldn't take it anymore. He looked his father straight in the eyes, and with tears streaming down his face, he shouted, "You think you can kill me like you killed our mother?" The room fell into a deafening silence. Obinna's hand froze in mid-air, and his heart seemed to stop. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. "Kamsi, what did you say?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Kamsi, his voice shaking with emotion, repeated the words that had been buried deep inside him for so long. I said you want to kill me just like you killed my mother. Since she died, you've never shown us any love. You treat us like we don't even exist. As Kamsi spoke, tears poured down his cheeks and his small body shook with sobs. Adaora, who had been watching silently from the corner of the room, burst into tears as well. Obinna stood there, stunned and speechless. His son's words hit him like a blow to the chest, and all the anger drained out of him, leaving only a deep, aching guilt. So, Kamsi saw me killing his mother? The thought echoed in his mind, bringing with it a wave of shame and despair. That night, Obinna couldn't sleep. He sat in the darkness, his mind racing with thoughts and memories he had tried so hard to bury. He remembered the night Chidinma had died, the rage, the violence, the blood. He had convinced himself that it was an accident, that he wasn't truly to blame. But now, hearing the accusation from his own son, the guilt he had tried to suppress came flooding back with unbearable force. He replayed Kamsi's words over and over in his mind. You want to kill me like you killed our mother. The truth in those words was too painful to bear. He had failed his children in the worst possible way, and now they saw him for what he truly was, a monster. As the night wore on, Obinna's thoughts spiraled into a dark abyss. He had lost his wife, and now he was losing his children. The life he had built for himself was crumbling around him, and he felt powerless to stop it. The weight of his guilt was suffocating, and for the first time, he realized that he could never escape the consequences of his actions. What would he do now? How could he face his children, knowing that they saw him as a murderer? The questions tormented him, and the answer seemed out of reach. All he knew was that the life he had tried to build on the foundation of lies and betrayal was collapsing, and there was no way to undo the damage he had caused. The next morning, Obinna sat at his desk at work, but his mind was miles away. The words Kamsi had spoken the night before echoed in his head, each syllable tightening the noose of guilt and fear around his neck. You want to kill me like you killed my mother. The sentence played on a loop, driving him deeper into a state of panic. He tried to focus on his tasks, but the papers before him blurred into a meaningless mess. He couldn't think, couldn't concentrate. His mind was consumed with one single terrifying thought. Kamsi knew too much. As the hours dragged on, Obinna's fear turned into a cold, calculated resolve. He realized that the only way to secure his secret was to silence Kamsi permanently. The idea horrified him at first, but the more he thought about it, the more it seemed like the only solution. By the time he left work that evening, Obinna had convinced himself that he had no other choice. His heart pounded with the weight of what he was planning, but he pushed his emotions aside. This was survival. In the days that followed, Obinna began acting differently. He started showing a renewed interest in his children's lives, particularly in Kamsi. He spent time with them, talked to them, and even began bringing them little gifts. Kamsi and Adaora, who had grown used to their father's coldness, were confused but hopeful. Maybe their father was finally coming back to them. Maybe, just maybe, things would get better. Obinna's sudden change in behavior didn't go unnoticed by his new wife. She watched with growing jealousy as Obinna paid more attention to his children, especially Kamsi. She confronted him one evening, her voice sharp with suspicion. Why are you suddenly so interested in those kids? You never cared before. What's going on? Obinna forced a smile, masking his true intentions. It's nothing, he lied smoothly. I just realized I've been neglecting them. But don't worry, You're still the most important person in my life." He kissed her on the forehead, but his mind was elsewhere, already planning the next step. A few days later, on his way home from work, Obinna stopped by a bakery. He carefully selected a beautifully decorated cake, one that he knew Kamsi would love. The baker wrapped it up with a ribbon, and Obinna took it with trembling hands, knowing the sinister purpose it was meant to serve. When he arrived home, Obinna called Kamsi over with a wide smile. "Kamsi, come here," he said, holding out the cake. "This is for you, a special treat. Make sure you eat it all." Kamsi's eyes lit up with surprise and delight. He couldn't remember the last time his father had given him anything, let alone something as nice as this. "Thank you, Papa," Kamsi exclaimed, his young heart swelling with happiness. He took the cake to his room, eager to enjoy it in peace. As Kamsi took the first bite, a sharp pain shot through his stomach. He winced, confused by the sudden discomfort. "What's happening?" he muttered to himself. The pain grew worse, twisting his insides until he could hardly stand it. Clutching his stomach, he ran to find his father. "Papa! Papa!" Kamsi cried, his voice tinged with panic. "Something's wrong. My stomach hurts so much." Obinna, his heart pounding with both fear and guilt, forced a calm expression. "It's nothing, Kamsi," he said, keeping his voice steady. "Just finish the cake and go to bed. You'll feel better in the morning." Kamsi looked at his father with pleading eyes, but Obinna's cold reassurance only deepened his sense of dread. As the pain worsened, Kamsi realized something was terribly wrong. He couldn't stay here. He had to find help. With one final desperate glance at his father, Kamsi bolted out of the house, clutching his stomach as he ran. Kamsi stumbled through the street, the pain in his stomach nearly unbearable. He knew he couldn't make it much further, but he remembered the kind neighbor, Mr. Chidi, who lived just a few houses away. Summoning the last of his strength, Kamsi reached Mr. Chidi's door and knocked frantically. Mr. Chidi opened the door, his face filled with concern when he saw the boy doubled over in pain. "Kamsi, what happened?" he asked, his voice laced with urgency. "Mr. Chidi, help me. My stomach. It hurts so much," Kamsi gasped, tears streaming down his face. Without hesitation, Mr. Chidi scooped the boy into his arms and rushed him to the hospital. Once they arrived, the doctors quickly diagnosed Kamsi with severe food poisoning. As they worked to stabilize him, Kamsi's fear and pain overwhelmed him, and he began to cry uncontrollably. "Mr. Chidi," Kamsi whispered between sobs, "I need to tell you something about my mother." Mr. Chidi leaned in closer, his heart heavy with dread. "What is it, Kamsi? What happened?" Kamsi's voice trembled as he recounted the events of that fateful night. "I saw my father. I saw him. He was so angry. Mama was crying. And then there was so much blood." Mr. Chidi's eyes widened with shock. He had heard the arguments that night, the shouting, the crashing sounds, but he had never imagined that it could have ended in such horror. "Kamsi, are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm sure," Kamsi cried, "and I found his clothes. They were covered in blood. I hid them because I was scared. I didn't know what to do." Mr. Chidi's heart sank. This was worse than he could have imagined. He had always suspected something was off about Chidinma's death, but hearing it confirmed from Kamsi shook him to his core. He realized the boy was in grave danger. Obinna wasn't just a neglectful father, he was a murderer. Back at home, Obinna paced the floor of his living room, his mind racing. It was taking too long. Kamsi should have been dead by now. What if something went wrong? What if someone found out? His heart pounded with fear as he imagined the worst. Just then, his phone rang. It was Mr. Chidi. Obinna's blood ran cold as he answered, trying to keep his voice steady. "Obinna," Mr. Chidi said, his tone serious. "Kamsi is with me. He's at the hospital. They are keeping him for a few days to recover from some severe stomach pains. Obinna's heart skipped a beat. Stomach pains? He repeated, his voice shaking. Yes, Mr. Chidi replied. But don't worry, he's stable now. The doctors are looking after him. Obinna's world began to spin. Kamsi was in the hospital, and there were too many questions he couldn't answer. The guilt he had buried began to rise again, choking him. What if Kamsi told them something? What if they found out? As he stood there, gripping the phone with trembling hands, Obinna knew that he had played a dangerous game, and he had lost. The walls were closing in on him, and there was no escape. The weight of his sins bore down on him, crushing his spirit as he realized that the truth would soon come to light. What would he do now? How could he possibly cover up the truth when it was so close to being exposed? The questions haunted him, but the answers seemed out of reach. Obinna knew that the day of reckoning was fast approaching, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. In the cold, unforgiving walls of the prison, Chike's true character shone brighter than ever. Despite the harsh conditions and the weight of his wrongful conviction, he remained kind, patient, and helpful to everyone around him. His fellow inmates and even the guards couldn't believe that a man like Chike could have committed such a heinous crime. He never complained, never lost his temper, and always lent a helping hand to those in need. As the years passed, Chike's reputation for goodness spread. It reached the ears of those in authority who began to question whether a man of such fine character could truly be guilty of murder. Finally, after much deliberation, Chike was granted amnesty, reducing his life sentence to just 12 years. It was a bittersweet moment. Freedom was within reach, but the years he had lost and the pain he had endured could never be returned. Throughout this ordeal, Nkechi had never wavered in her support for her husband. She worked tirelessly to care for their children, doing whatever she could to make ends meet. The struggle was immense, but her love for Chike gave her the strength to carry on. 3 days later, as Obinna sat alone in his grand office, the walls seemed to close in on him. The fear that had been gnawing at him for a while had become unbearable. He knew he had to visit his son, Kamsi, in the hospital. But how could he face him? The thought of those innocent eyes looking at him, perhaps with knowledge of what he had done, was terrifying. Still, Obinna knew he had to go, if only to maintain the illusion that he was a concerned father. He picked up the phone and called Mr. Chidi, asking for directions to the hospital. Mr. Chidi hesitated for a moment, sensing the tension in Obinna's voice. He agreed to give the directions, but as soon as he hung up, he went straight to Kamsi's room. "Kamsi," Mr. Chidi said gently, "your father is coming to visit you." Kamsi's eyes widened in fear. "Please, Uncle Chidi, don't leave me alone with him. I'm scared." Mr. Chidi's heart ached for the boy. "Don't worry, Kamsi. I'll stay right here with you. I won't leave your side." When Obinna arrived at the hospital, he found Kamsi in bed with Mr. Chidi sitting by his side. The room felt heavy with unspoken words. Obinna tried to put on a smile, but it faltered under the weight of his guilt. He couldn't bring himself to look Kamsi in the eye, and the visit was filled with awkward silence. Every word felt forced, every moment strained. Obinna knew that his son sensed something was wrong, and it terrified him. That evening, Kamsi was discharged from the hospital, and the following day, he and Mr. Chidi made their way to the police station. Kamsi had been thinking a lot about what had happened to him, and he knew deep down that he needed to speak up. With Mr. Chidi by his side, he found the courage to tell the police everything he knew, the events of that fateful night when his mother died, and how his father had tried to poison him The police listened carefully, their expressions growing more serious with each word. They realized that this was no ordinary case of family conflict. There was something far darker at play. Immediately, they launched an investigation, and it didn't take long for the pieces to fall into place. Obinna was arrested later that day, his crimes finally catching up with him. The police uncovered the truth of Chidinma's murder and the attempted poisoning of Kamsi. Obinna's carefully constructed life crumbled before his eyes as the handcuffs were placed around his wrists. At the same time, Chike was finally released from prison, his name cleared of the false charges. The moment he stepped out into the fresh air, tears filled his eyes. The nightmare was over, but the scars it left would remain forever. Nkechi and the children were there to greet him, their faces etched with relief and joy. They had been through so much, but they were together again, finally. As the story ends, there are key lessons we can learn. Obinna's downfall was a result of his guilt and lies. Instead of facing the consequences of his actions, he tried to hide them, which only led to more pain. The truth has a way of coming out, no matter how deeply it's buried. Chike's honesty and kindness stood out, even in the darkest times. His patience and strong values ultimately led to his freedom. This shows that maintaining good character, even when faced with adversity, can lead to redemption. Nkechi's loyalty to her husband, even in difficult times, highlights the power of love and family. Her dedication kept her family together through the hardest of times, showing the importance of standing by those we love. Kamsi's courage to speak up about what he knew helped bring justice to his family. It teaches us that telling the truth, even when it's difficult, is crucial in righting wrongs and preventing further harm. In the end, justice was served. Though it took time, the truth was revealed, and those who committed wrongs were held accountable for their actions. This reinforces the belief that justice, though sometimes delayed, will eventually prevail.